Hello everyone, let's get into 36, Lyndon B Johnson, or LBJ. He was affectionately known as. He actually liked that sort of initial, being called LBJ. This man, right, is a master politician. He was the vice president under Kennedy and is sworn in Dallas, actually on Air Force One with Kennedy's body on the plane, a very somber place to certainly be sworn in as president. But what Johnson does is that he uses Kennedy's death to great advantage. Kennedy was an idealist and had but unfortunately wasn't able to get a lot passed through Congress. Johnson is taking the president's death and uses it as a martyr and uses that as a way to get more passed through Congress, saying that we should have done this in the memory of the president. This is what the president would have wanted. So he's very good at getting a much accomplished as president. But unfortunately, though, he's going to suffer from the Vietnam War, which we'll get into momentarily. So he serves out the rest of Kennedy's term, and then he gets elected to his own right in 1964 to a landslide, huge landslide over Barry Goldwater. But at the same time, though, he could have ran for another election in 1968 because he only served less than half of Kennedy's term. He certainly could have then served his own second term as well. Because of the Vietnam War, he decides not to run for re-election. So, notable events. We'll focus first on domestic issues. Basically, Johnson sees FDR as his greatest hero, and because of that, he really wants to extend the New Deal. He wants to do more than FDR did in the New Deal. So his policy, his programs are called the Great Society, or also the War on Poverty. And it was his belief that America had so much economic power and privilege and advantage that we could end poverty in the United States. And it wasn't one of those, campaign slogans. He literally believed in it, meant it, and wanted to see it happen. So there's a lot of programs, kind of like the New Deal, to help do that. So I'll give you a few of them. The first one is the Economic Opportunity Act. Economic Opportunity Act. And this was in 1964, and the goal of that act was to basically give aid to inner cities and areas of poverty and use that aid to help bring them out of their poverty. Direct aid by the government in those areas. Okay. Another area of influence was in education. They passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And again, this was federal funds to schools to promote better education across the United States. So we're starting to see more government involvement in school programs. All right. 1965, a very important aspect was Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare and Medicaid. Now, this is federally funded health care, which is obviously always an issue. It still is an issue today. And Medicare was for elderly. For if you reached a certain age, you got health care basically funded by the government. Medicaid is for health care for those who are more in poverty. Okay, so these are still around today. Both programs are around today, and these are a lasting impact of the Great Society. Another aspect was in a Water Quality Act and a Clean Air Act. So again, this is kind of like the New Deal, more of a larger, bigger government involvement in the economy, in social programs, social welfare programs. Okay, he was also a big advocate of civil rights. And he probably did more than any other president before him in terms of civil rights in the modern time period. So 1964, really important Civil Rights Act of 1964 that banned all discrimination in employment in hotels, restaurants, public places. So you cannot discriminate in these places like theaters, hotels, movie restaurants, right? You could not discriminate in these places. That was huge. This pretty much ends segregation in the South. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, huge law. There was no more literacy tests. Okay, so before you would use this tactic. If you couldn't read, you couldn't vote, as a way to kind of keep people from the voting. This gets rid of that. And then lastly, 1968, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 bans discrimination in all housing, not just federally funded like the one I mentioned about Kennedy. This is all housing. So, for example, places even like in Western New York during this time period, certain areas were redlined, that meant that African American families couldn't even get a house in these areas. Even if they had the best credit, had the money to pay for a house in cash, they would not be eligible to get that housing. Okay? That ends that. Now, the other big issue certainly is the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War will basically kill the war on poverty. You can't be spending $1 billion a month in Vietnam and try to fight the war on poverty. So under Johnson's administration, we already went over this in class a little bit. In 1964, 2 U.S. naval vessels, the Maddox, M-A-D-D-O-X, and the Turner Joy, are fired upon in the Gulf of Tonkin by North Vietnamese. Now, there's some debate about this. It's kind of like the Maine when we started the Spanish-American War. Was it the North Vietnamese? Was it, something else? But anyway, it is the sort of rallying cry to escalate the war in Vietnam. After this point, a very important law is passed called the Gulf of Tonkin, Tonkin resolution. And this is basically Congress gives President Johnson full authority to conduct the war in Vietnam. So again, we're not really declaring war, but Congress just gave him the right to do so, basically. So he's got a blank check to do what he wants in Vietnam. So in 1965 is Operation Rolling Thunder, where 150,000 troops are on the ground. By 1968, it's over 500,000. In 1968 is that important Tet Offensive, which was like the Vietnamese New Year. Basically, this was a coordinated attacks against all U.S. installations by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. The U.S. handedly puts it down, but the problem was the press portrayed it as basically almost a North Vietnamese victory. Here's the reason why. President Johnson kept on telling the American public that the war is almost over, we're making great progress. But then how could that be so if, this just happened? So many people felt that the president wasn't being honest. So the term is that there was a credibility gap with President Johnson, that he lost the faith of the American people. And once he lost that, basically, he decides not to run for re-election. He comes on television in a somber manner, and that's pretty much the end of his career politically. We do have a couple of amendments that are important. I'll give you just one of them. The 24th Amendment is there are no more poll taxes. You can't charge people to vote. The other one I'll give you is the 25th, which is about presidential disability. What do you do if a president gets a stroke or has a severe illness and is alive but can't carry out the duties of the office? How do we do that? This is actually a throwback from President Wilson when he got that stroke and his wife Edith pretty much ran the White House. They're trying to deal with it more officially. Okay, miscellaneous fun facts. Johnson's about 6'3", big guy, 210, dressed very fashionably, but preferred to wear his Western clothes because he had a ranch and liked working on the ranch. Very competitive personality, relished power, very stubborn sometimes, but also very warm and loving. Grew up fairly poor in Texas, worked on the family farm, even shined shoes during the Depression. Recreation, liked to play dominoes and poker. And again, had that over 400-acre ranch in Texas where he retired. He lived for a few years after being president, but kind of a broken man from the war, unfortunately. All right, well, thanks so much, and have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.